In the last portion of our worship today, I wanted to look still at Acts chapter 16. We see that the jailer had comfortably gone to sleep as he had put his prisoners away. And I want to think for a moment about the earthquake. The earthquake that had shook the jailhouse to its foundation, because it says that doors flew open, chains fell from the walls, nothing lay between the prisoners and the ability of being able to escape. All could just run off and go into the night if they wanted to. Looking at the jailer before midnight, all was under control. Sleeping soundly in his bed in his quarters, no worries, nothing at all, to all at once be awakened by what was a tremendous earthquake that had happened there. It was no accident that his life now fell into crumbles. Knowing that the doors were open and that the prisoners could run and that they could escape. If those prisoners had escaped, he'd been better off dead than suffer humiliation and the penalties that went along with the jailer that lost his inmates. In fact, it teaches us through the law that in Roman law, if a jailer allows or if somebody escapes from that jailer and they find that the jailer had something to do with that, or if the jailer wasn't doing his job, he took on their crime and their punishment that was there. So he pulled his sword knowing what was to come for that, and Paul, knowing that the jailer was going to commit himself, yelled, Do not kill yourself. We're here. A few hours ago, he probably barely noticed the beaten Paul and Silas as he put them away like he would normally do anyone else and move along. Now, that same Paul saved his life. Now look at that jailer. He called for lights. He rushed in to Paul and Silas's cell. In trembling fear, it says that he fell before them. And in fact, verse 30, he said, Sirs, what must I do to be saved? He goes on to say that he washed their stripes. And they washed him and his household in baptism. So what did they teach? We know that they taught Jesus. They taught Jesus and His life. They taught Jesus and His death, His burial, and His resurrection. They taught baptism to remove the sins from your life, to put you on a path to righteousness. It says he took Paul and Silas to his home and he fed them and greatly rejoiced. What a change you see in two different attitudes. One of uncaring, one of whatever it takes to get the job done so I can go home, and the other of I'm introducing these prisoners to my family. He went to sleep hardened to the suffering in this jail, and at midnight he fell at the feet of the sufferers. That afternoon he was a hardened man in a hard world. That night he was a saved man filled with joy. I think there's some important facts, just other than looking at this one instance of conversion that were there. But I think first we need to note this question. Why was it ever said, Sirs, what must I do to be saved? You know, there's no way to know if this man heard Paul and Silas preaching prior to his arrest. We do know if he had heard, he was very unimpressed because it said that he had fell asleep in his quarters. He seemed to be a typical pagan in a pagan's Roman world. So why ask that question? Singing those songs, he may have heard those songs and known that they were a religious couple. That they were religious in their thoughts, they were religious in their ways. A common pagan belief focused on God's acting favorably in behalf of those with whom they were pleased. So it was really not unusual to attribute events like an earthquake to the act of a god. Since Paul didn't escape, it would seem likely from the pagan perspective that the gods were with him. But for whatever reason that was done, I think there's some obvious thing. The jailer realized Paul and Silas had a special relationship with a deity, and then he knew that they just saved his life. And I think that kindness that was there impressed him. That kindness astounded him, and he knew that they could address the need. I think it's also obvious that he didn't understand what he was asking as well. He did not know the source of salvation, how to approach the source, how to change the condition that he was in. So he was looking at those that he thought that God had favor with, that if they can do it and if they can live and they can have a demeanor like this and not act like the natural human way of rushing out of the jail, trying to escape the punishment for whatever crime that he thought that they committed, they must have had a different heart about them. Note what learning about and believing in Jesus did to the man. It says that he had washed the beaten, bruised backs of Paul and Silas. No jailer would do that. Had to be the first time. This uncaring man that went to bed watching them bruised and bleeding now was washing the backs of these saving men of grace. The insensitive man became sensitive. And that's part of the example of the existence of a Christian that knows that their sins have been forgiven from this world and that they have freedom. We become sensitive to other people's needs, don't we? So we talked about the insensitivity of Christians in our first part. Now we're talking about the sensitivity of Christians in our second. One of the examples of looking at what a true believing Christian is the sensitivity that they have to the needs of one another. The sensitivity that they have of being the example that other people can see about the bond that they have with Jesus Christ and their other believers in Jesus. The relationship that not only you have with God through Jesus, but also the relationship that you have one with another in the church. How much you love and how much you care for them, about getting about God's business. Fourth thing is conversion. Believing in Jesus, repentance, baptism, it's initiated a new direction in this man's life. He took Paul and Silas out of jail to his home and fed them. He did this in the joy of his salvation. They charged them. They put them into prison. They took everything that he thought was important to them and they took it away from them. They took their freedom away and they gave him nothing. After this earthquake, we see the change that was made in this man. The joy that he had for his salvation. The ability of knowing that he now had no doubts of what his future held. And it had to be a part of Jesus. Did it come from being scared from the earthquake? No. Did it come from him making a different change of changing himself before he pierced himself with his own sword? Possibly, but that came from the plea of Paul. Did it come from him seeing the influence of a Christian upon his life? Of seeing something different, completely different in his life and wanting what they had? I have no doubt that this was the first time this man did anything like this to his prisoners. They were different for him to see. They were different for him to know. Jesus came to destroy human insensitivity by destroying sin in our lives. Let's make that clear. Jesus came to destroy insensitivity. people's lives. For us to be sensitive enough to be able to look at the hearts of another individual, see the suffering of that, and respond to that suffering. He wants to destroy your insensitivity as well. He wants to make you a complete person by making you a compassionate person, suitable for an eternal relationship with God. Would you ever think that God would allow a non-caring person in heaven? Do you believe God would allow someone that didn't want to work with the church? The unity or tearing it apart, would they be allowed into heaven? How do we let God make us sensitive in our own right? Humbling ourselves before God, knowing that we don't have all the answers. Truly putting our faith and allowing our faith to overcome the fear of failure. Working with our local congregation so that we can see and know that we have purpose as a Christian in our lives. That we have a purpose each and every day of who we are and what we are. Belonging to God. Belonging to His church. I ask today for you to look at this jailer one last time. See the insensitive man that he was before, with the pagan thoughts and the human directives, and then looking at what he become, of how caring he was to even these beaten prisoners that he had no idea who they were before, but yet after knew that they were truly men of God. Who do we identify with? If we identify with one, we got to continue to press ahead, don't we? Allowing others to see our compassion and our motives as an example of living a Christian life. But if we're insensitive to a cause, if we're uncaring and unkind and unloving, do you believe God is satisfied with us in that way? So I pray today that if we're subject to either one of these, we make the right move in the one that gives us danger of missing heaven. Won't you come?